Welcome to everybody. It is a pleasure to see everyone. We're going to start a new series today. We're doing a 4-part series. The topic is Judaism, a value system or a legal system. And intuitively, I think we all know that it is a little bit of both. But let's before getting there, let's try to appreciate some of those ideas. A number of the questions that we're going to be dealing with throughout the course of the next few weeks are the first one, which is it a value system? Is it a legal system? How Torah conveys values? How Torah conveys laws? What happens when there's a clash between values? What happens when there's a clash between law and value? And who determines those values? Is there morals outside of the Torah system which determine the value system? A lot of interesting and important questions which we'll be dealing with over the course of the next few weeks. Today our topic is how the Torah conveys meta ideas. Not just an idea, not just a law, but how the Torah conveys values, bigger system ideas. I'd like to start off by thanking our sponsors this morning for today's shir first, and I'd like to start off by thanking Rosemary Fish, who's sponsoring today's shir upon the yortzeit of her sister, Dr. Linan Dumont, Leah Esther Bas Devora Rivka Leah Shalom. She should have continued Aliyas Neshama Be'ezras Hashem. We also want to thank Chaya and Josh Glickman, who are sponsoring for Chaya's father's upcoming yortzeit this Wednesday, Mr. Sol Schoenfeld. Shlomo Ben Pesach David, Olav Hashalom. And Be'ezras Hashem, I hope that the Neshama has a continued Aliyas Neshama in Gan Eden. And those who knew him should, Be'ezras Hashem, have continued nachas from him, and those who knew his children have continued chizuk from his memory. We also want to thank Marilyn and Elliot Lauer, who are sponsoring upon Marilyn's mother's yortzeit, Mrs. Judith Abram Steinberg, Yehudis Libis, really. Bas Simcha HaKohen. We're coming up on the fifth yortzeit this year, and obviously somebody whose leadership has transformed our community and beyond. And we are beneficiaries. Be'ezras Hashem, we should have continued. We should have continued nachas from her and her from us as well. And we also want to thank Barbara and Yitzhak Siegel, who are sponsoring for Yitzhak's mother's yortzeit, Mrs. Rose Siegel, Sarah Rasa Bas Rafael. And we thank them for being with us from afar. Be'ezras Hashem, and Shama should have an aliyah. Let's learn Torah together. So it should be obvious. Oh, thank you so much. Is anybody who needs an extra source sheet? Oh, there we go. Mosh, thank you so much. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you so much. If anybody needs extras, they're right over here. Let's start with this topic at the very beginning. It should be obvious to us that every legal system has values behind it, because a system which is simply a legal system will not succeed, because the ideas that birthed that legal system clearly were meant to be conveyed. It's just very clumsy to convey values when you regulate action. That's the problem that exists. So I have an idea. I want society to be governed in a certain way. So I set up a law, but inevitably there's going to be problems with that law. And when you have a society which is simply a by the letter, living by the letter, or living by the loophole, essentially, society will come to problems. And in fact, the Gemara describes that this was one of the reasons why the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, was because of such a society where they decided that Judaism was a legal system rather than a value system. So as an example, take a look at source 2. The Gemara about Mitzias says, this is amongst a much larger discussion about another topic. The Gemara says, Asher Yasun, quoting a pasuk, that a person must perform. And the Gemara explains, or Darshans unpacks those words to mean Zu lifnim mishura sadin. That is going beyond the lishura sadin. Shura sadin literally means the letter of the law or the line of the law. It says, D'amar Rabbi Yochanan lecharva Yerushalayim ela al shadanu ba din Torah. The Jerusalem was destroyed because the court systems exacted din Torah, the law of Torah. So where it says eladina de meziga de ledaini. So wait a second. So you must the decision making should have been completely arbitrary, right? It should have been based on another legal system. What do you expect the courts of Jerusalem to issue their verdicts based on? So the Gemara then says, Elo ema shehemidu dinaim al din Torah v'lo avru avdu lifneihem mishra sadin. They never demanded beyond piety. They never demanded something more than simply the letter of the law, and they let the case lie just as is, because technically speaking, the person who did X really doesn't need to pay for such a situation, because technically speaking, There's a very famous and well-known effect which has been named now called the Cobra effect, which was based on actually when the British were in control of India, and there was a problem in New Delhi of cobras. There were too many snakes in the city. So what the British did was they set up an incentivization system where anybody who would come in with the skin of a cobra would be rewarded duly. And what they found is after the first few months, not only was there not a decrease in the amount of cobras in the city, but there was an increase in the amount of cobras in the city, despite the fact that they were actually shelling out a huge amount of money. Because what some very innovative individuals did was they started setting up cobra farms, right, in order to be able to claim the rewards, right? This works in all kinds of situations. And I think it was down in Kentucky where they had an incentivization program to hand in firearms. They gave a price for firearms, and they found that the first people in line were the gun dealers who had went to the nursing homes to buy off the guns of the elderly to bring them in for money. And the second people in line were the people who were trading in their old guns in order to be able to take the money to contribute towards their new automatic rifles, right? So, meaning the idea of living by the letter of the law doesn't work, right? There must be something bigger. And then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, how do you convey something bigger and how do we understand something bigger, both on the side of the lawgiver and the law, so to speak, abider, the citizen in that society? How do we get there? Those are the questions that one would need to ask. And Judaism, I think, struggles with these things. It would be much easier to have a value system, but then value systems are too airy-fairy, right? You can't talk about just value systems. You need to have a legal system. But once you have a legal system, then you get the literalists who just say, well, that's what it says in the book, and therefore this is the only way we need to do things. And so the question of today's topic is, if there are values, which we definitely assume there are, the Gemara is saying that we are punished for not having noticed them. So how does the Torah convey that to us? Where do we look to find those? And so the argument today is very simple, that there's 3 avenues in which the Torah does this, and we're going to look at each one individually. And they are prescriptive, descriptive, and inductive. Because let's take a step backwards and appreciate them. Prescriptive, and that is sometimes the legal system will actually talk about values. It'll talk about meta ideas which are beyond the specific minutia of a particular action. So let's think about those together. Can anybody think of a prescriptive value? The Torah says, keep a value, not a law. Keep a value and not a law. Okay, so that's an interesting one. So what Paul's suggesting is go in the ways of God, right? So, by the way, that actually is reduced to laws, right? Mahu rachum atu avata rachum. So it does reduce it to, or mahu mevaker cholim af atu mevaker cholim. So the Gemara reduces that, so to speak, distills it into actions, quantifiable actions like bikr cholim and levayas hames. But that is a good example of where the Torah gives you a big idea, and that big idea has to be understood or defined, right? But you need to be godly, right? A being like the divine. That's an example of that. Any other sort of that come up? Good, loving a friend like yourself, yes. Okay, good. And again, by the way, notice that the Gemara will reduce these. The Gemara will say, this is what it looks like, right? Because we need it to be tangible. But in the end of the day, the Gemara, the Torah is giving it to us in a bigger sense. I'd like to discuss 3, which are very famous ones, but they affect us on a daily basis as well. And that is the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim. It's called Parshas Kedoshim because the Torah tells us, Kedoshim tiyu, be holy. Okay, I want to be holy. So what do I do? How do I be holy? So Rashi tells us the word holy, the word kadosh, always means. Good morning, Rosemary. The word holy means what? Rashi tells us separation. Right. So Rashi tells us the holiness is related to separation, which means that I need to be prushim. I need to be separate. What is the separation from? Rashi tells us immoral relationships. Right. It says you want to be holy. Then make sure that you distance yourselves. Make sure not to be a little too close for comfort for those who are one's not supposed to have a relationship with. However, the Ramban very famously tells us that there is a meta principle at work here, which is bigger than the law. Rashi is telling us this is a law, right? Meaning there are relationships which are forbidden, so distance yourself. That's really a tangible law, right? The Ramban says it's more than that. Take a look at source 4, and this is such a very beautiful, beautiful idea which we come across, and it's sometimes emphasized but sometimes forgotten. Inyan, he says, the law idea over here is when you talk about inyan, that's not a law. Inyan is the idea, right? The matter. Ki Torah hizhira ba'arayos v'melachos ha'asorim v'etzira bia ish b'ishtoi v'achilas b'asa v'yayin. There are certain parameters. There's certain things we're not allowed to eat. There's certain relationships we're not allowed to engage in. But there are certain things we are allowed to enjoy in life. There is the opportunity of the sexual activity within marriage. There's opportunity of indulgence when it comes to food. There's much that Jews can eat, and look at the menus just down Central Avenue, folks. Right, what's available today? It says Im kain yimtza bal hata'ava makom lios shatuf bezimas ishtoy on ashav harabos lios besoyve yain bezalele basel lamoy. It's quite plausible for a person to be completely indulged in life, living an indulgent life within the parameters of the law, right? Whether it be within the confines of their marriage, within the confines of kosher, within the confines of free speech. They can say whatever they want, do whatever they want, act however they want, and essentially be what the Ramban calls, the outcome is naval, is, how do you translate that word? Disgusting. A disgusting person within the bounds of law, right? So you can clearly have missed the boat. You're supposed to be what a Jew looks like, and you are acting simply like what a heathen looks like on the street corners in Russia, who can't put two words together after they're drunk and stupid, but that's how you are because it's mutter, technically speaking. Right? That's what the could be the outcome. And therefore he says, Lefichach ba'akos v'acharei sheperat ha'isurim she'asar legamrei v'tziva b'divrei klali b'dvar klali sheniya perushim min hamutaros or mosros. That a person should exercise additional caution. A person should be that to take in all these laws to an outcome. Yema'et v'mishkal. And he goes on to describe that a person should be balanced in the way they interact in this world. And skipping down to the next paragraph, and he says, this is where this general mitzvah comes, this value-based mitzvah. The Torah tells us some very specific red lines. And that's what it means when it says Viskadashtem elu ma'im rishonim, Visem kedoshim elu ma'im achronim, Ki kodosh zeh shemen arev. And then he goes on to say how Chazal are going to quantify some specific items, but the idea is meant to be think about exercising caution, think about exercising balance, think about what the Torah wants of us, not just what us to do, technically speaking. And there again, the Ramban is addressing this particular idea of being a naval b'rshus Torah, which is very plausible and unfortunately is not so uncommon in when it comes to legal systems where people just live by the letter of the law. Another example, the Ramban says, and this affects us today, is the Torah tells at the beginning in Parshas Emor, it says, it talks about, it's actually referring to Rosh Hashanah, but it's a law which applies to Shabbos as well. He says, Yelachem Shabboson, it will be a day of rest. So Shabbos and Yom Tov are meant to be days of rest. What does it mean, Shabboson, rest exactly? So he says, in the second paragraph, the Ramban again, in the second paragraph of Source 6, says, Nearly, Shamedrash hazeh lomar, shenitzavinu min haTorah liyos lanu menucha b'Yom Tov afilu midvarim she'ena melacha. We're demanded to rest, to cease from activity which may be mutar. Because technically speaking, based on biblical law, I could really carry a lot, and I could end up, sweating a lot as I'm brewing my produce from the granary to the storefront, and I'm measuring it so I can really get ready to sell. And I can clear this, and I can move that, and I can set up my shop over here, because that's technically not, there's no actual, I'm not doing charisha, I'm not doing zariya, I'm not doing any of those activities. So we'll set up a city that's going to have an Erev, so we no longer, it's going to be surrounded by a wall, so we won't have a carrying issue. You amusim ala chamorim, and then we'll have the entire marketplace will be open, right? Because we'll have it avoiding all the technical biblical problems. The store will be open, and the store owner is crediting. Why crediting? Because he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to do right. He doesn't want to write, because writing is the problem, right? And everybody's dealing with money, because money, technically speaking, isn't an Issa D'Oraisa. ויהיו הפועלים משכימים למלאכתם ומשכירים עצמם בכחול לדברים האלו וכיוצא בהם. And the workers, okay, all the other problems, will just hire people to do the rest, right? They'll be switching on and off the lights because these are all not biblical, right? So he says, "V'hutru hayomim tovim ha'elu," and there will no longer be Yom Tov. V'afilu haShabbos atzmo shebechol zeh ein bohem mishum melacha, because technically speaking, it isn't melacha. Lakach amra Torah Shabboson sheyiyeh yom shavisa u'menucha loy yom Torah v'zeh pirush tov yafeh. And the Ramban says, here is what it's meant to look like. I'm giving you what it's meant to look like. It's meant to be a day of rest. Yes, there's 39 basic principles, and they have subcategories, but that it is not meant to be just that. And therefore, by the way, so how is this remedied? So how do we fix this? What is the fix for the concern that he says, the picture that he's just painted for us? What happens? Good. So the Rabbonim, Chazal, set up certain Gedarim, which means, just to appreciate what's happening over here, and this is important for the next topic we talk about, that means to say that Chazal looked to the meta principle, right? They looked to the value of Shabboson, and they said, we need to tighten those loopholes, right? We need to make sure that it won't look like that based on the principle what we know the outcome is meant to be. Does that make sense? Okay, so now, which means that Chazal have a part to play in the expressing of the values. That's an important step of understanding what Chazal are doing, and we'll try to get to a little more to that next time, is what the role of Chazal are in this. But this should be obvious as to what the end is. And I believe that's the same thing that happened with electricity, to be honest. Right? If you look at the original, like when electricity is starting to become commercialized, so we're talking about the mid-19th century, okay, the mid to the end of the 19th century, and then the halachic decisors are starting to talk about, are you allowed to not use, but switch on electricity, is the question. Switch on and switch off electricity. And there's a great debate at the beginning, because at the beginning there was a discussion about havara, lighting a flame, and that's because the initial electricity was used for what purpose? Electricity, and for light, and the way that they used the way that light was achieved in those days was by huge resistance, which clearly was havara actually at the very beginning, right? If you read about the initial light bulb attempts at the beginning, I mean terrifying attempts around the turn of the 20th century, and what we were just in the late 1880s and 90s as to the run for the patent towards the light bulb before Edison, and what they were doing in public in London and Paris. I mean, people died when they touched these things, these incandescent bulbs. So initially there was an idea that this is havara, and then there was the machlokes, the Chazon Ish and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, this is boino and makeh bepatish. But I would argue that whatever the technical, so to speak, vehicle for the Isser was, there was an understanding already that this is a problem with Shabboson, and thank God. Right? Thank God that the Rabbonim of the time had such intuition. Because imagine what today would be like if electricity was mutter. Imagine how un-Shabbos dick it would be. Yes, sorry.
Isn't that where we have something like Uda Dechol? Like something that whole...
Yes. So they even created a category of Uda Dechol. Now it's so hazy, it's so grey as to what that is. Right? You know, what specifically... That also, again, has parameters, because not everything is Uda Dechol, and sometimes you'll see it thrown in as a... But you're right. That's another example where Chazal are saying there's something. And actually, interestingly enough, it's actually a small category, ironically, in terms of halakha, because most of the rest of it is regulated based on this. But what do you see over here is that there is Shabbos, but there's a principle of Shabbos, and that principle of Shabbos sometimes needs extending or applying in certain cases, where based on one word, the Torah tells us this is what it's meant to look like, and we know what it's meant to look like, and somehow 3,300 years later after Sinai, we're still getting that right. We're still getting most of that right as well. These affect lots of very complicated decisions that affect communities. I'm not going to get into some of the more complicated questions about what Shabbos should look like in our locale, on main areas, in the relationship of restaurants, as an example, being open on those times is a very tough topic. But it's these are some of the questions which are asked as a function of this. One other example of this, but there's the Torah tells us in Parshas Devarim, in Parshas Vayechanan, it says V'asisa Yashar V'Tov. What is it? How do you translate that roughly? Yashar V'Tov. It's very hard to write. Yashar usually means like straight, and Tov is good. Well, that's a little too broad. So again, the Ramban tells us this is a meta principle. He says listen to how beautiful this is. He says in source 8, Ula Rabboseinu Bozeh Midrash Yafev Amru Loi Zu Pshara v'lifnim mishuras adin. This means compromise and going beyond the law. V'akavana bozeh, in source 8, I apologize. Uvakavana bozeh, ki mitchila omar shetishmor chukasov ve'edosov asher tzivcha v'ato yomar gam b'asher lo tzivcha tein da'atcha la'asoi satov ve'yashar be'enav. First, the Torah tells you what to do. Now it tells us, okay, now I've told you what to do. Just apply that. Be a good person. Be a nice person. Be an upright. Be an honest person. As an example, Ki ohev hatov v'yashar v'zeh inyan gadol lefi she'i efshar lahazkir b'Torah kol hanhagos ha'adam im shcheno v're'o v'kol masa'o matano v'tikonei ha'yeshuv v'amedinus kulam. The Torah simply cannot enumerate every single human interaction. It can't talk about the neighbor who's parking their car halfway across the driveway of their friend. It can't talk about the person who puts a cone by the public parking spot in order to... It can't talk about double parking. It can't talk about every single iteration of non-menschlichkeit that arises in society. He says, Aval, acharei she'izkircha mehem harbe kagon lo telech rachel. Don't be a talebearer. Lo takum lo titor. Don't take vengeance. Don't stand by and downfall your friend. Don't curse those who cannot hear. Stand in front of the elderly. So it says, then just get the message and do it. Be that kind of person that Torah asks and begs of us. But technically speaking, no. Stop it. Stop waving that finger and just act like a good person. That's what the Torah is telling us. And the Gemara actually gives an example of an expression of this law. And it actually quantifies this into Shulchan Aruch. What's the halacha? It's called Dina Debar Metzra. What's Dina Debar Metzra? The Gemara Baba Basra talks about. So let's say you have neighbor A and neighbor B. And neighbor B is selling out. He's moving to a new neighborhood. He's moving down south, and he's going to sell his field. So it is upon him, it is incumbent upon him for him to first offer the field to neighbor A before he opens it to open market. Why? Because it is more useful to A than it is to anybody else. Because A can now have a double plot, and if he has a double plot, he can now start bigger. He can start it's not just that he's got A 1 and 1, which gives him 2. He can now make a warehouse which he couldn't make when it was just simply A, and therefore you have the responsibility. Similarly, when it comes to inheritance, there's din bar metzra. When it comes to, let's say, one of the properties is adjacent to one of the brothers, and the other one is in the French Riviera, but the fellow on the French Riviera says, well, technically speaking, I'm older and I would like to take that field. No, you have to give it to the other sibling who is adjacent because it's more useful to them as well. That's, again, a quantification of this idea as a whole. I remember that I once had embarrassingly, a number of years ago, I had a situation which was one of those hazy, grey things where we tell ourselves, I'm sure it should technically be right? And we got into the situation, and somebody was very upset about something that we did, and I went to Meir Twersky, and I said to him, Rebbe, technically speaking, right? So he says, I want to tell you a story. And I've told the story a number of times, but it's important to reiterate it. That when Rav Moshe Soloveitchik used to live out in Eastern Europe, this was now in the 19-teens, early 1920s, and he was a case, a particular disagreement was brought in front of him between a Jewish employer and a non-Jewish employee. And they both respected him, and they brought this case. There was a payment issue. And as they were sort of explaining the case, in Yiddish, the Jewish employer said in the equivalent in Yiddish of, he says, Rebbe, cut me a good deal, which essentially is an admission of guilt, right? So he says, Rebbe, cut me a good deal. And so Rav Moshe Soloveitchik stood up and he hit the table and he says, you pay him right now, right? Meaning you're not going to play games, Jew, non-Jew. And start backpedaling, back-channeling, and so that was the end of that. That was the end of that. A few years passed. A knock on the door at 10 o'clock at night, and this non-Jew was in. He says, "They're coming for you tonight. Get out." And that was the reason Rav Moshe Soloveitchik made it to America. And because Rav Moshe Soloveitchik made it to America, guess what? His son, Rav Yoshua Soloveitchik, also later on, afterwards, made it to America, and we're forever indebted and grateful. And that's just because he was an honest person. And that was because he was an honest person. And Rav Twersky says, I don't really care if it's technically all right. He says, but you should not be in such a situation. You should never be in a situation where it's grey, where you have to rationalize to yourself that it's all right, and I'm sure that if looked at it at a particular angle, the error of parallax would help us. No. you have to be out, yashar v'kosher. If there's ever a rationale that comes in, and I'm sure that, then you know you're on the wrong side of the yashar. So again, so this is what we call the prescriptive, where the Torah actually, from time to time, will tell us big principle. This is what we're supposed to be getting at, and even though technically there's not enough time for the Torah to indicate every minutia, this is what it's supposed to look like. Some of these are expressed in Chazal, some of them are left open to us, and we have to make those decisions. Sometimes we have to make very hard, value-based decisions, which are not technically in the book. That's idea number one. Now it gets a little more complicated. So these are the easy ones, because the Torah tells us this. It's not easy to apply them. I remember I was actually at a Shiva house. Dr. Huberfeld's father passed away a number of years ago, and I was sitting at the Shiva house, and a fellow walks in, nobody knows who he was, and he sits there for a while. He gets up, and at the end, I was there, and he says that he gets up and he says, I was an employee in the supermarket a number of years ago, and he always used to pay his employees on time. And then he said, "Amakom Menachem," and he walked out. Folks, if we could be on the other end of that, for the end of our lives, we could have an employee saying that he always used to pay us on time. That's really important. Just understand that, despite all the exigencies and all the things, that's us as a Yashav Tov, just doing the right things. Right, now let's talk a little bit about the next stage. This is called descriptive, and this is a question that the first Rashi in the Torah asks us, is like, let's cut to the chase. Rashi quotes Rabbi Yitzchak and says, why does the Torah start at Bereshis? I mean, we love the stories; it's fantastic, it's so exciting. But in the end of the day, Tachlis, let's start at Parshas B'Shalach. That's when we get national mitzvahs. That's when we become a nation. Let's talk about what it's all meant to be. And what Rashi is essentially saying is, why do we need all the stories? Just tell us what it's all about, and we'll listen to it. Let it be a textbook of law, right? 1.1.1a, right? Do X, right? So you should now count the new month, because it's going to facilitate, in order to make facilitate festivals. Here's what festivals look like. That's what it should be. And so what does Rashi answer in this case? Just interestingly enough. Right, why does the Torah start at Bereshis? Land of Israel. Right, so the Rashi says it's about the land of Israel. And interestingly enough, he says that the strength of his actions he gave to his people, that Hashem gives and takes land depending on what he wants. And I always wondered, why it isn't that nobody's ever, the Israeli ambassador to the UN doesn't just whip out this Rashi and say, folks, I don't understand. Why are you telling us that we're thieves, which is precisely what Rashi said is they're going to say. Just pull this Rashi and it says, well, all of Genesis, folks, is to tell us that we own it. And nobody seems to ever take that as a given. So the truth is, I think that Rashi wasn't talking to the UN. Rashi was saying, Koach ma'asav higid la'amor. Because of us, we need to figure that out ourselves first. We need to stop doubting it. There was a greater percentage of evangelical Christians in this country who voted for the move of the embassy to Jerusalem than there were Jews in this country. So we've got to start being proud of our heritage a little earlier than everybody else. That's what it starts with, which again, by the way, is not a law. What is it? It's a value. And so therefore the Torah actually goes to great lengths to tell us these stories, because embedded in the story is a value. Sometimes in moments of weakness, I say to myself, I look in the mirror and I say, aren't rabbis just glorified storytellers? Because in the end of the day, you can give these drashas and you can give all these ideas and so on, and then you throw in a joke and somebody comes in there and says, Rabbi, that was just so great, that joke. That was the best drasha I've ever heard. And the idea. Yeah, but the joke was just fantastic, Rabbi. It was just, that was the best drasha I've ever heard. And 5 minutes later, I don't even remember the idea. It's just about the story. It's about the joke. It's, they say, how does it work? How often can you repeat? So they say, for a joke, you have to wait, a good few, 6-7 months or so. For a story, maybe 3 months. And for a Dvar Torah, between Friday night and sort of Shlishis is all right, that's enough time for repetition, all tongue in cheek. But the point is that sometimes you just wonder, isn't it a sad moment? So I actually had the opportunity just recently of spending time with the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Greater Washington, Rav Aaron Lopiansky. And he was just here in the 5 towns. There was a number of Rabbanim who had the opportunity of spending time with him, and I asked him this question, and we were talking about this, and he said, you know what? He says, stories are the greatest vehicle for conveying values. And in fact, that is precisely the way to convey values, more than any ideas, more than any thoughts, more than any loops in logic. really the way to convey ideas is through stories. It's the way we do it. And that's why the most successful of ideas, the most transformative of ideas come through stories. And the Torah recognizes that, and that's why it starts in such a way. Where the Torah is not just telling us our cultural beginnings, and it's not just telling us our stake in this territory, it's telling us more than that. It's telling us who we are through the way they act, and we're supposed to replicate that. As an example, the Sefer Netziv, the Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva in Volozhin, wrote a Pirush on the Torah. He wrote a number of Pirushim on the Torah, but one of them was called Ha'emek Davar. That's the most accessible of them. And in his introduction, he talks about the names of each of the books. And he gives a different name for each book than the ones that we usually use. So as an example, instead of Genesis, which is essentially the book of creation, what's the word the name of the book, or the first book of the Torah that he uses? Anybody familiar? He calls it, based on a midrash, Sefer HaYashar, the book of the upright, of the straight. What does that mean? So he says, in source 10, Sefer B'yichud B'kinu Yesharim. Why is it called the book of those who are upright? That's what Bilam, a non-Jew, Gentile, prayed that he would have Achrisoi, his end would be like Yesharim, Tomos Nafshi Mos Yesharim. Va'inyan, Dinisba'er B'shiras Ha'azinu, al Apostol Hatzur, Tamim Paloi, Ki Kol Drachav, Mishpat Tzadik V'Yasharhu, Hashem is Yashar, Hashem is upright. The Shevach Yashar, who Ne'emar Lahatzdik Din HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'churban Ba'is Sheni Shoyador Ikeshub Saltel. There we're saying that Hashem, you are right in destroying the Beis Hamikdash, even though we thought otherwise. That they might have been great righteous people who studied Torah, and that's pretty much what the Gemara Bava Metzia was saying, is they had so much Torah and so much of a Torah society, and they was just so corrupt as human beings. That was what was happening then. Al Kain, חשדו as מי שראוי שנוהג שלא כדעתם ביראת השם שהוא צידוקי והאפיקורס. And this sectarian group and that sectarian group were all killing each other. Listen to Dr. Abramson's incredible lectures at the end of the realm of the second temple, and hear what was really going on over there. And these could have been really pious individuals who were holding to the letter of the law, and yet they're completely intolerant of any other group. Right? It seems almost prescient in terms of what's going on today. What's the same society ripping itself apart. And it led to terrible bloodshed. Until the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Most of the destruction was done before the Romans came, as a function of infighting. That's why we talk about Hashem. What's the tziduk adin tzadeiku? Yasharhu. We're saying that Hashem was righteous because He is Yashar. Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yasharhu ve'einu sovel tzadikim ka'elu. Hashem does not appreciate righteous people who are not upright. Ela be'ofen shecholchim b'derech hayashar gam alichos olam v'loi ba'akmimus af al gav shemim shel Shem Shamayim. D'zeh gorem churban abriya v'arisos yeshuva aretz. And he says, and that's what it means by the avos. So zeh haya shevach ha'avos shem milvad shayu tzadikim v'chasidim v'oy ve'Hashem be'ofen hayoser efshar od hayu yesharim. The way that they dealt with even the Gentile neighbors who had nothing in common religiously, they were Yesharim. Look at the way that Avram is described by the Bnei Ches. They recognized his moral greatness. That's what it means to be a Yashar. And by the way, the Avos lived before the giving of the Torah, which means they didn't even have the possibility of the legal textbook in the same way that we do. And yet, they were Yashar. Perhaps maybe even because of the absence of the legal textbook, it was easier to be Yashar because you understood the values were more than just the legal system. That's what's described, that's why it's called Sefer Yashar. And so therefore, there's numerous examples in Halacha of where we learn these things. So as an example, Rambam says in source 11 that there's a notion of zirizus, of alacrity. Where do we learn that from? Vayashkem Avram Baboker. There's ideas of that. So that's the Gemara in Yuma. Then we know that that the idea of caring enough about one's neighbors to even rebuke them, right? Meaning to say not the American way, which is just to live and let live and let them die and let die, because I don't care what's happening to them, is to get involved enough to say, I care about you. You know that your water's still on. You know that the way you do things, you're probably going to get a ticket. I'm going to tell you something because I care enough about you, about my neighbors, that we learn from the fact that Avraham Avinu is willing to go to bat for Saddam. Meaning these are ideas which are bigger than simply the law itself. These are examples and many, many, many examples of what is called descriptive values. I remember I was on a flight recently and I was having this debate. I was at a Yarchekala down in Florida a year ago, and one of the topics we had the opportunity to learning with Rabbi J.J. Shecht, and he was talking about this topic of to care enough to give rebuke and the difficulties of giving rebuke because if people are not going to respond to it. And I was on the plane back, and it was still the time when flights you had to be all masked, right? And it was at the time where things were still flaring up and the whole business. And I was on the plane, and it was amazing because 2 rows ahead of me was this couple. I think it must have been a Chabad couple, and they spent the entire flight learning Torah. It was amazing, just like with each other. They were learning, and it was beautiful just to listen to. And the difficulty was they were also the only 2 people on the flight who weren't masked. And I was like the back of the row, and the stewardess was like busy talking about this couple, that was the problem couple, and they kept on coming over to them and so on. And I was so torn, because it's so beautiful. On the other hand, it's like, they clearly flaunting the laws. And I don't care what you believe about masks and vaccines and who's in control of the vaccine and who, Google's. I don't care about all your conspiracy theories. But if you're in a place where they say this is the rule, just act like they know you're Jewish, right? They know you're Jewish. So just pretend you care about everybody else. Forget about what you believe in, right? Google invented the virus. Okay, it's magnetic. Okay, but let's just behave in the way that's so. So I was debating this, and I was waiting for my luggage because I actually had brought carry-on, but guess what? Got checked. Okay, so I was waiting at the. It was one of those flights, like one of those flights you spend the whole time like you. And so I came out there, and I was sitting there, and I said, shouldn't I? And I said, I want to tell you something else. 2 rows behind you, the Torah was unbelievable. I've never been on a flight where I've heard such beautiful learning between a husband and a wife. They're just sitting there, and I said, but I also want you to know that I was listening to the stewardess, and they were busy talking about those people. And when they talk about those people, because of this, I said, it's so easy to make a Kiddush Hashem, but make a Kiddush Hashem properly, right? And the moment I said that, the eyes went blank, and that was it, checked out. I wasn't listening, who cares? Some idiot telling me. So it's so hard to do this, but you have to care. The point is, but we learn this actually, the Torah quantifies it later on by but it describes it early on. Now, by the way, what's the danger in this model of this model of value conveying values?
Conforming to society too much.
That's not so much a danger. That's a loss, right? But the danger of this is that description is open to the interpreter, right? So that's the danger of this, is that I could read Sefer Bereshis and learn from Shimon and Levi that when I don't like people, I just wipe out the city, right? So the point is that you need a little bit of guidance, moral guidance, when it comes to how to exercise description, right? So otherwise, I could end up doing terrible and heinous crimes. But so it requires a Masorah. It requires a certain tradition accompanying that description, or otherwise I will arrive at the end of the wrong conclusion. The problem with the descriptive is it's sometimes a little hard to do this, although I think that we do have a sense of truth and when we know we're justifying, then we know that we're wrong. The third place is, I think, a little more interesting, and we're going to spend a little more time on this in 2 weeks' time, is what's called inductive. So induction, just as a quick reminder for those who appreciate mathematical induction. You remember how induction works as opposed to deduction? So induction is where I need to induce a rule. So I have a pattern. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have to induce the rule, and the rule in that case is what's called n plus 1. That's the rule of the series, which is the number plus 1. Right. Then it gets more complicated when you have things like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. Then what's the rule then? The induction is n squared. But then it gets more complicated. You understand? So we can just start making the series or the details more complicated to induce a more complex rule. So what induction is looking at the outcome, the details, and saying what's the rule behind this? What is the formula for the series behind this? That's the process of induction. By the way, that's the methodological way that Gemara conveys or Mishnah conveys education. It's inductive, not deductive. If it was deductive, or if it would be laid out in front of us, and then we can deduce the results. But here it is actually a conversation about X. And you have to realize that X, actually, that debate means to say that the value behind it is Y. That's called induction. If I'm listening to, an example I give in America is, if you're listening to a cricket match and you have to figure out the rules from listening to the commentator, right? So you hear about all kinds of things, and it's like, it all sounds completely foreign, right? It's the same as when I first listened to a baseball match. right? Where it's all completely foreign, but you suddenly put the pieces together, a triple header, like where's the third head? Like, like all these things, like you suddenly start putting all the pieces together, you induce the rule. So the same is true about Torah. So a number of examples is this. Actually, just a number of years ago, Abby gave me the opportunity of visiting the offices of the Honorable Jack Weinstein, of blessed memory. At the age of 95, I think we went when he was still rendering decisions in the district court, and his topic was, he gave an annual lecture on environment on a topic in Judaism, and he wanted to talk about environmentalism. This is around 2015. When it was a sort of change of presidencies, he was worried about the future, and he wanted to talk about environmentalism and Judaism's relationship with it, and he really wanted to have a specific, a specific mandate that Judaism talks about environmentalism. And we went through a number of the topics, and we put together a beautiful collation of material on this topic. And the truth is that it's not so easy to say that the Torah demands X, not Y, because the Torah, in this case, actually we can induce principles, but we can't prescribe principles, as an example. So, there's multiple times where the Torah talks about the idea, but how we apply it is somewhat more complicated. But the rule is induced. So, as an example, the Torah talks about how that human beings are placed in the Garden of Eden. La'avda l'shamra. La'avda is to cultivate, to develop, to expand. L'shamra is to preserve and not to destroy. Right. So we see examples of this where the Sefer Chinuch talks about, let's say, sorcery or basar v'chalav, like meat and milk, are all examples where we start mixing different species lines. We start playing games with the way that nature is to destroy it in a way that's incorrect or beyond correction, and that is considered improper. We hear about ideas like when we are supposed to besiege cities and how we treat the trees of that city, not simply the fruit trees cannot be destroyed. And the Sefer Chinuch says in source 16, שורש המצווה ידוע שהוא כדי ללמד לנפשנו לאהוב הטוב והתועלת להידבק בו, ומתוך כך תדבק בנו הטובה ונרחיק מכל דבר מכל דבר השחסה. Although technically speaking, Baal Tashchis is in the situation of war, and specifically a fruit tree, it also applies itself in the lunchroom. It also applies itself in other aspects of life, in our commercialism, the way that we deal with things, and that when something's broken, we don't fix it, we discard it and replace it. The fact that when something's half empty, we throw it out and just buy something new. It's meant to convey to us rules. Other examples in the Torah is where the Midrash says in the Koheles Rabbah, Re'eyes ma'aseh Elokim ki mi yuchol l'takenas asher yivsoya pasuk in Koheles. Hashem gave a tour of Gan Eden to Adam and says, look how beautiful my natural ecosystem is. I created for you human beings. To make sure not to destroy it. So again, multiple different points. The Torah is not prescribing a specific policy. The Torah is telling us values which we put together, we get a sense, we induce that the Torah does care about environment. Another example is in halachic terminology. There are certain things which are not allowed to be in yishuv, in settled areas. And one of them is, one of those things is that we're not allowed to have is ashpasois or kivshanos. We're not allowed to have industrial plants, or let's say furnaces and kilns within the yeshuv where people are living, because it affects other people, right? So we convey these ideas. Now, if you're to say, well, specifically, how far away, is this? The Gemara does prescribe it. But what about a chemical plant today? What about pipelines that run from a cattle? There's complicated questions which have to be answered. Where do cruise ships, right? Commercial cruises, where are they allowed to let out all their garbage? What do we do with subway cars? All these questions that arise today. What about the sinking islands in the mid-Pacific and global warming? These are real issues, right? And how do we? So the Torah is not saying a specific policy, but from all the touch points, these ideas, we see there is a value in the Torah of looking after the world and not destroying. We see there is a value in the idea of respecting Yeshuv. These are examples of where we have to induce. And now it is left up to us to understand the Torah. The Torah does not believe in commercialism. The Torah believes in usage for specific good. But ultimately, how does that look like? More complicated to apply itself. Similarly, when it comes to damage, let's say that you have a great insurance policy, you're at the end of your car lease, and then somebody really annoying is bothering you. You could, technically speaking, say, well, if I just rear end them, right, they're going to have to pay a whole lot more than me, right? And I can drive off and everything's fine. So does the Torah allow this? So the Torah actually never says the principle of don't damage somebody else's property. You know that? The Torah never says that. The Torah talks about paying for other people's damage to property. So you could say, well, I'll take it, I'll bite it because I really want to create them aggravation. I know how long it is at the body shop. I've got my neighbor's an auto body repair fellow. He'll take care of it in one, and they'll have to go and send their car in 3 weeks. And so I'll swallow the money and take care of it. How do we know that it's not allowed? So the reason again is through induction. As an example, the Torah tells us in source 19 about a shor. If let's say your ox goes and kills, God forbid, you have to pay, and there's even perhaps a potential theoretical death penalty on such a person. And then we hear in source 21, you cannot stand by where your brother's blood is being spilled. In source 22, you can't deny, you can't steal, you can't withhold wages. The Torah says, Rabbeinu Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, the precursor to Shulchan Aruch, says in source 23, in what is the Chosh and Mishpat today, he called it Chosh and Mishpat, you're not allowed to damage as in the same way that you're not allowed to steal. L'shalem ubilvad shaloi yehei anus kagon im nafal al agag baruch shen mitzuya v'hizik aval im nafal baruch mitzuya v'hizik chayev delav anusu. As long as it's within your control, do not have the right to damage another person. Where did he learn this from? The Torah never said it. He learns it from the fact that the Torah talks so much about the responsibility of paying that the Torah obviously assumes that damaging itself is a problem itself. So this is even in the halachic world, is you can induce laws. We're going to take a look in more detail when we have a little more time in a couple of weeks' time at a specific example which will deal with animal rights, hopefully, in terms of Torah law and what the Torah law says, and perhaps some of the induction principles there, which is a fascinating example, case in point. But be it as it may, we have three different angles. How does the Torah convey meta values? Answer is, or meta ideas, values. One is it tells us sometimes the value. That's prescriptive. Sometimes it will describe a value which we're supposed to learn from that because that's the most easy way to learn with a danger of misinterpretation. That was induction, right? Where we will see that there will be a number of different touch points or facts which come together to produce a rule, produce a value, a larger arc into what Judaism is expecting of us. And this therefore leads us to an interesting conclusion. I'd like to end with the introduction to the sefer called Ma'alos HaTorah, which was actually the brother of the Vilna Gaon. You know, sometimes we always become a relative of somebody, right? Right? At some point in time, we're somebody's child, and then we're somebody's sibling, and then we're somebody's spouse, and then we're somebody's parent, and then we're somebody's grandparent. So we always become somebody's somebody, right? Which is good, because that means you've got important people in your family, right? It's good. So he was the brother of Vilna Gaon. He wrote a book called Ma'alos HaTorah, a very short sefer, where he says, and this is a beautiful, and we'll close with this. He says, "V'shamati me'achi ha'gaon zal shoresh hadavar shebevada leika lemeimar." We cannot say you cannot say there's only 613 mitzvahs in the last source in 24. Because then, technically speaking, there's only 3 mitzvahs from the first, really essentially 1/5 of the entire Torah. There are many parashios which don't seem to include a single mitzvah. Clearly, that's not acceptable. Ela be'emes kol dibur v'dibur b'Torah sheyatzeh mipi hagvura hu mitzvah b'fnei atzmo. It is possible to look at the Torah that every word, every pasuk contains a mitzvah. And you may say, wait a second, when we're learning the descendants of Esav at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, what mitzvah is there? But he's saying that if one looks hard enough, if one's able to distill enough, you can see that in fact in the marriage systems of Esav, and who Timnah marrying the Eliphaz, and Timnah wanted to be part of Yaakov, and there's actually a mitzvah, there's actually laws about how we treat those who perhaps are not appropriate to be married in, but how we reject people is even learned from places like that. And therefore, he says, if you look at the Torah as a whole, don't limit it, don't quantify it as 613 mitzvahs and that's the cap. There's much more to the Torah as a whole, which now leads us, and we'll close it with a question. And that is that when the Torah is conveying to us these ideas, and there's the different ways of phrasing this question, is the Torah aligning itself with principles which we know to be just independently? Meaning, if we were left if we were a baby left on a desert island, brought up by the wolves, and we were to be then confronted with a particular idea, would we nod and say that idea makes sense? Is Hashem trying to align with what is, we'll call it the true north in every human being, and we have that inside of us? Or do you say that no, God said something, And because he said it, it became moral, and that's why we are more notea, we are more inclined in that direction. Which is it? Is God choosing something which is externally moral? And therefore the question is, so where does that come from? Does God give credence to that? Where did that come if it's not outside of his word, technically speaking? Or do you say that his word is what actually created morality itself? That's the question one step back from what we're doing, which is the space for morality in the world. Folks, we'll hold it here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Look forward, Mr. Shem, to continuing our learning together.